Yes, my name is Joanne Dufour, and I'm a former Seattleite who has returned to Washington State, and I'm delighted to be reconnected with you folks. But what brings me to this panel is an effort that began with the United Nations Office for the Unitarian Church, and I'm going to self-promote myself because it landed up in a blog. And so part of my remarks will be what I've learned in doing this blog. And the blog was connected with the event of having a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons being adopted by the General Assembly, and it is in the process of entering into force. Still in the process. Okay.
Good. I'm Mark Fleming. I'm a member of Veterans for Peace here in Olympia, and I got into this back in the early 80s with the nuclear freeze when that came about, and have been interested in it ever since, and realized I needed to get back into it when I saw, I guess, when Donald Trump came in, it made me realize we've gone way too far with nuclear weapons, and it's time to make sure we stop it. So there I am.
Good job. How many people have heard from Peter today?
He's here.
Yeah. Oh, I know. But so when Peter pops in, maybe he will say a word about himself. But if you've heard him this morning already, he's a good activist and speaker. So did you decide?
Yeah.
Okay. So Mark's going first.
Right. So this panel is ideas for action. You know, what we can do to abolish nuclear weapons. So what I put together is an idea to think about nuclear weapons as something that is somewhat removed from us, and how do we individually address that. So we're talking about what you can do at the local level. We really focused on that here with the local coalition, finding what individuals can do here. And what I did is I took on myself just the idea of learning about nuclear weapons. Because the nuclear weapons environment now is very different from what it was 30 years ago, 60 years ago. We tend to think of it back as Cold War days, and really the threat is still very much the same, but the nature of that threat has varied. So we need to think about how to address that. So what I did is I went back through and looked at, well, why do we have nuclear weapons, and what are the plans for them? So I got down into the weeds. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this, because one of the things I think is really important is at least to have an idea about what our government is planning to do with nuclear weapons and why. So to think about that first is, you're all pretty much familiar with the arsenals. They're considerably reduced from the Cold War when we had tens of thousands. We're down now, I think, to a total of about, right now, the U.S. has just under 1,400 strategic weapons deployed. Russia has about 1,500 deployed. We also have a bunch of stockpiled weapons that could be redeployed. So they're still out there. And we also have, in addition to the U.S. and Russia, we have three other what are called recognized nuclear states, France, China, and the United Kingdom. All those are recognized as nuclear states by the Non-Proliferation Treaty that was signed and went into effect in 1970. Then in addition to those, part of the deal with the Non-Proliferation Treaty was that the rest of the world said, we will not seek nuclear weapons, and we expect the nuclear nations to disarm. So what we've done about half of that. Many of the other countries have not gone out to pursue nuclear weapons, but the five nuclear nations have not eliminated their nuclear weapons. And in addition, we have any number of non-NPT nuclear states. We have Pakistan, we have India, Israel, North Korea, and then FAS estimates that there are maybe up to 20 other states that aspire to nuclear weapons if the circumstances admit. So there is still this sense that nuclear weapons are a legitimate exercise of national power. And one of the things that I certainly want to see is to delegitimize nuclear weapons as a legitimate source of nuclear power, or national power. And in addition, we talk about the big arsenals, but we also know that even a small nuclear exchange can be dangerous. One of the researches I saw was that like in the event of like an India-Pakistan exchange of a small number of weapons, say 40 to 60 weapons, could create a, could cause agricultural productivity to decline by about 10 to 40% over several years, immediately after the war, and maybe over 2 billion people will be at risk of starvation. And this is, this is a 100-weapon nuclear exchange. And if you have a larger war, just think of those impacts being exponentially increased. So that's the current status. We also have just fissionable material that's out there. They've done a fairly good job of securing some, but again, that's always the possibility that non-state actors will have it. So nuclear threat is going to be there as long as we have nuclear weapons. We're also witnessing what I call the collapse of the nuclear arms control system, which, as flawed as it has been, has at least put a structure around it. The U.S. has withdrawn from the anti-ballistic missile treaty back in the George W. Bush administration, and Donald Trump has taken us out of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. And so the only one we have left now is the START II treaty, which is up for renewal in, I think, 2021.
It ends in 2021.
Yeah. And there's some doubt about whether we'll do that. In fact, the Russians are expressing some frustration with the United States over the fact that don't seem to be very interested in doing that. So this whole structure that has at least put some kind of control on nuclear weapons seems to be dismantling. And one of the things I looked at, is how we plan for nuclear war. So I'm going to ask how many people here are familiar with the Nuclear Posture Review? Fairly informed group, so that's usually when I say but I get like very few hands. The current Nuclear Posture Review was developed in 2018 by the Trump administration, and this is a periodic thing. So every 5 years or so, they look at what weapons do we have, why do we have them, how will we use them, and the Trump administration has they're continuing a first strike policy. The United States reserves the right to use nuclear weapons under a variety of circumstances. It reversed the Obama administration's policy of not using nuclear weapons against countries that are in compliance with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Right now, the current posture review says we will use them as we feel they are needed. It also expands the circumstances that we'll be using them. So it's not just if they fire nukes at us, we'll fire nukes back at them. It specifically says things like if they attack our cyber structure, our infrastructure with cyber attacks, or if there's a terrorist attack, we could use a nuclear weapon. So suddenly we have a much greater range for using them. And it also calls for the modernized nuclear arsenal. And I use the term modernized in quotes because what they're really doing is building a whole new generation of weapons. And these are what are called smart weapons, more accurate weapons, more usable weapons. And in fact, what these will do is actually destabilize the nuclear system because suddenly, oh, this is only a small nuke, so we could risk that. So suddenly we have the system where it's possible that we may want to use them. And then beyond the Nuclear Posture Review, we have what's called the Joint Operational Plan. And what that is the Defense Department's policy. Here's how we're actually going to fight a nuclear war. And that's really deep in the weeds. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you read it, but I'll point out that well down in there it says, integration of nuclear weapons employment with conventional and special operations forces is essential to the success of any mission or operation. So nuclear weapons are part of a continuum. And you start out with grenades and bayonets on one end, and you have nuclear weapons on the other. So all of that is there for the commanders. And of course, we also have the question about accidents and misinterpretations. If you spend any time, probably most of you know that we've had any number of near misses. In 1961, we dropped a nuclear bomb on Goldsboro, North Carolina, and it didn't go off. Yeah, and that would have sent a pretty good-sized plume of radiation up the East Coast, major population area. We've had several situations during the Cuban Missile Crisis. One of the Russian submarines there had a nuclear torpedo, and the commander wanted to fire it. And one of his officers, I think, took 3 officers to agree to do it, and one of them said no. And they didn't fire. Another time, the Russian radar interpreted, I guess, some light coming off waves as nuclear missiles coming in, and it said, "We're under attack. Go, launch our counterattack." And he looked at that and said, "This isn't right." And he refused to do that. And they didn't fire, and it turned out it was a false alarm. That person, that particular officer, I think, spent, I'm not sure if he was actually sent out of the service, but since he didn't follow orders, the results were not really good for him. But at least that, that's how we've avoided these accidents. We talk about, well, nuclear weapons have never been detonated since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we haven't had any accidents yet. We've got all these near misses, so that's why they're so dangerous. So looking at what the arsenal is, the likelihood of accidents, here's why we need to get rid of them. So with all that, you may ask, well, what is it you do? What can you do here in Olympia? What can you do in your community? And I say, we've put together a group of people who are learning about nuclear weapons and going out into the community. So we've got a speakers bureau. We've made some presentations, some church groups to Panorama Democratic Study Group. We've talked about going beyond that, trying to get out into like service clubs, like Lions Club, Rotary. So far, we haven't had any success with that. I've also thought about going to veterans groups. Haven't really tried that yet. I'm not sure I'm quite ready for that. But I think, we figure about, we would all have the common goal of staying alive. That's pretty simple. So how can we present that? But right now, we have about 4 or 5 of us who can go out and talk knowledgeably about nuclear weapons and what some of the options are. We've done tabling at the farmers market, at some of the other events. We also have here, I mentioned earlier, I think Lon mentioned it, Glenn Anderson has a blog called Parallax Perspective, which has an immense amount of information about nuclear weapons, about the issues. He also produces a monthly program. Joanne and I and Bob just recorded 2 hours worth of programming on nuclear weapons with him the other day. The first was going to be shown in December, and the second half was shown in February. So we have that option as a way of getting the word out, and that can reach a broader audience. It's on channel 22 here in Thurston County, and it's also on the internet. So people who are not readily familiar with it can get that information. And then along with that, we have a group that goes out every week on the interstate freeway overpass. We have about a 6-foot by 10-foot banner that says "Abolish Nuclear Weapons." So we're out there every Thursday. We're doing it now almost 2 years, holding that sign. Gets pretty good response. Got a lot of honks and waves every now and then. Somebody waves with one finger, but for the most part, it's pretty positive. Yeah, pretty popular. I go back to the nuclear freeze movement because that was an area where people were very familiar with some of the dangers and definitely did not want to see it go forward. And they organized and mobilized, and within about 6 years, Ronald Reagan had gone from from trying to fight a nuclear war in Europe to negotiating a treaty with Mikhail Gorbachev. It's one of the treaties that Trump has just abandoned. But the idea that millions of people came out and said, "We don't want this. Here's what we do want." I keep going back to that, thinking, how can we get that kind of action and interest again? And right now, it's a matter of just telling people, trying to get people to understand what the problems are and realize it's still there. I think most people seem to think that nuclear weapons are just kind of gone. I know after the Cold War, I kind of thought, yeah, so it's over, but I realized that was wrong, so that's why I'm back here again. So that's what we're doing here in Olympia. So I'll turn it over to Joanne.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'd like to present this in a personal way, partially because I don't have any of the background and expertise that the Veterans Group has, or people like Glenn Anderson. I'm relatively new to this, but the newness has allowed me to learn an awful lot in the last 2 years. So what has happened is that personally, in 2017, suddenly in the news was a treaty that was being discussed. And the treaty had the unusual title of a treaty to prohibit the nuclear weapons. Now, there's a whole story to that treaty, but when the Unitarians have their intergenerational program, which they did in the springtime, that was the topic. And my job happened to be to coordinate the panel that was the kind of like the featured panel. So, okay, I mean, I'm walking on unusual territory here, but people knew what they were talking about, and I just had to kind of make the context. When the panel actually occurred, I fell in love with each one of the presenters as I heard them speak, because what they were sharing was something extremely poignant and exciting. The poignant came from the ambassador from Palau, and even though Palau was 1,000 miles from the Marshall Islands, and you might have heard me say the Marshall Islands, we forget that we not only killed people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but we bombed 67 times the Marshall Islands. I think there were some deaths that resulted from those bombings, and we've never recognized that. But anyway, there was a young woman there, and she was part of the panel. She came on a bicycle. She was very, very attractive, very young, very dynamic, a feminist. She happened to be part of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And the division that she works for is Reaching Critical Will. And what her job was to be, well, the convener and I'll tell you how this story progressed, but she was a convener, one of the conveners of the countries that we're going to be talking about this treaty. But she's on the blog, and the blog is here for anybody who didn't get a card yet. So she said, we have been taught that these weapons are not meant to be used. We are taught that they protect us from conflict, war, and further nuclear proliferation. This lethal myth is based on the premise that in order to maintain international peace and security, we need certain countries to wield the capacity to slaughter citizens, incinerate cities, and destroy the entire planet. We believe that nuclear war will never happen, that nuclear weapons prevent it. But many of us, and she speaks on behalf of the other countries, including the majority of the world's governments, understand that the only way to prevent nuclear war is to eliminate the nuclear weapons. The recent alert in Hawaii, do you remember that, a couple of years ago? And then there was another one in Japan after that, could have prompted a nuclear war. And that kind of brought us back to the consciousness and, of course, the hijinks that were going on between North Korea and the United States. Okay, so it is in this spirit that 122 governments voted to adopt a treaty. Well, let me back up and tell you how that happened, because one of the next blogs happened to talk about and research ICAN. And if you remember, ICAN, the International Coalition Against Nuclear Weapons, won the Nobel Prize in 2017. Well, why they won the Nobel Prize was because they were part of a grassroots movement. They were one of the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, that asked the question, how did this treaty on chemical weapons ever get started? Because there was a preceding treaty on disarmament. There has been several treaties about the disarmament issue, but how did they ever get themselves started to the point that you got a treaty and got the treaty passed? So they were going to be the grassroots kind of, the how-to. We're going to follow somebody who got it done. And what had actually happened is periodically they have a review. When they have a treaty, especially the non-proliferation treaty, they get together and they review, well, how are things going? Of course, this Article 6 that you referenced, where the nuclear countries are supposed to promise disarmament and never have, began to take a sour note because practically all the countries in the world belong to the NPT. So that the majority of members of the NPT don't have the nuclear weapons. They're the ones who she was citing their opinion. And they began to say, we're getting hijinks by this. Why can't we just think of getting rid of these doggone nuclear weapons? And just a few countries sort of voiced that back in 2010. Well, it just takes a few to start the conversation. So by 2012 and 2013, they started to have some meetings of those who were thinking, well, this might not be a bad idea. The group started, and it started to grow. It went up to 44, and then it went up to 77. And by the time we're getting to 2015 and 2016, we're getting into more countries that saying, you know, this is a wonderful idea. Of course, none of these countries had nuclear weapons. Some of them were part of a nuclear-free zone. Some of them were part of the non-aligned group that didn't want to take sides in this kind of thing. So the voice was spreading and gaining impact. Well, the UN stepped in, and together with the work of the NGO, ICANN, and certainly WILF, they started to say, well, let's have very serious meetings about talking about a treaty. And they invited to these meetings 3 speakers. One speaker was Peter Moore. Now, Peter Moore is the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And as a Red Cross volunteer, I can get his newsletters. Well, Peter Moore came out with a rather dramatic speech. You know, we at Red Cross, we come to emergencies. And in the case of emergencies, we set up shelters and we render help. Well, how can we possibly render help in a nuclear situation? The hospitals are gone. The doctors are incinerated. How, in fact, can you seriously treat people after a nuclear war? And asked him to graphically remind us what it was like in Hiroshima and what the Red Cross had to do after Hiroshima, which is amazing work considering it was the first time. He says you can't even replicate that because the bombs are so much stronger these days. Mm-hmm. All of that would have been destroyed. So it's irrational to think that you can, there's absolutely no plan to what to do after, it doesn't exist. Okay, we just have the weapons, but nobody's really planning, suppose. Well, he was very effective. They brought out a Hibakusha, one of the victims who had survived in Hiroshima, and she was extremely effective. And then they brought out the Pope. Oh, God bless the Pope. This is Pope Francis, who strongly said about, well, let me tell you what he said. The treaty gives hope to those now living and those still to be born that one day our world would be free from nuclear weapons. States signing the treaty have rejected the fallacy that might makes right, and its pernicious, modern corollary that some nations have the right to nuclear weapons while others do not. He questioned the pretension of nuclear states that the weapons they hold as historical legacy, as theirs by right under the 1970 Non-Proliferation Treaty. He urged the nuclear weapon states who were parties to the treaty to fulfill their obligations toward a nuclear-free world, which is explicitly, as we said in the Article 6. He came out totally in favor of the countries that were resisting. Strongly. Matter of fact, we found out that this next week he's visiting Hiroshima personally. He really believes in this, and I had the chance to actually interview the ambassador at the UN, who is from the Vatican, and he was amazing. He was so supportive. He wrote me a 14,000-word piece that I could use, and I didn't plagiarize because I cited his source, but I mean the support from his office just for the blog was inspiring.
Joanne, you have another minute.
Another minute? Okay. Well, what has happened in the process of this, what the treaty does? It was written by the ambassador from Costa Rica. Lest we forget, Costa Rica, remember, has no army or navy, no armed forces. Period. It outlaws, prohibits the development, the production, the testing, the acquisition, the stockpiling, the transfer, the deployment, the use and the threat of the use of nuclear weapons. When they were talking about abolition, they were talking about every single thing. Now listen to this. Other items of consideration: the prohibition of its parties from assisting, financing, encouraging, and inducing others to carry out any of these prohibitive acts. You can't even talk about it. Isn't that wonderful? I mean, when you're talking about abolition. Anyway, as things go on, the treaty was open for signature in July. No, actually in September of 2017. We are now at the point of having been ratified by 79, no, having been signed by 79 countries. There were 122 countries that passed it when it went before the General Assembly and said, let's create this treaty and open up. So 122 countries said, yes, absolutely, that's 2/3 of the world, guys, if you're counting weapons and ladies. By now, we are up to 33 countries. We need 50 countries to sign it, and at that time, it enters into force. Now, what does that mean? It means that this treaty is legit. In other words, countries have said, we adopt this within our own constitutional systems, or whatever systems they have. Now, what happens with any of the treaties, even though there are countries that have not ratified that, or will not even consider any of the 53 countries, the 9 countries plus all their satellites. And we're talking about Russia, I mean the whole gamut, the whole nuclear set didn't want them. They said that in time, this becomes an accepted practice. And this is what they were learning from the chemistry, the chemical weapons people. In time, it becomes an accepted practice that nuclear weapons are prohibited. It takes time for it to happen. And even if countries have not signed on to the treaty, forget it. It becomes customary law. And customary law, this is accepted practice. So the feeling there is we've gotten this far and we're on this road. We're not stopping.
Is there a deadline?
No,
Good, thanks.
no, not at all.
Thank you. Thank you very
But
much.
the fact that we're 2/3 of the way already is, you know, if you know about international law, that's record speed.
It is record speed. Huh?
Yeah.
They said that about the EPA. Okay.
Peter, you're going to do a little self-introduction.
Oh, okay. So the first thing I'm going to say is that I am going to seek to not talk for very long, maybe just a minute or two, because I was just up there for an hour speaking, so I don't think I need to expound a whole lot further, and I'm very interested in starting a discussion and dialogue here in the room. So I serve on the Nuclear Weapons Abolition Task Force of Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility, also on the National PSR Committee for Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, and as I said in the main auditorium, I've worked for various nonprofits over the years, program staff, Global Exchange, Resource Center for Nonviolence, and so forth. So, like I say, I don't want to talk for very long. I just want to touch on a few key points. And I think we realize that there is a spectrum of efforts, of approaches to dealing with the nuclear arsenals. On the one hand, groups like PSR, for instance, which are working on very specific lobby proposals, bills in Congress, what's going through committee, what votes can be influenced perhaps in the Washington delegation and other congressional delegations around the country, the Hold the Line Act, the No First Use resolution, and so forth. Then, at the other end of the spectrum, there are folks who are working exactly, as you say, on a treaty for complete outlawing, abolition, prohibition of nuclear weapons. ICANN won the Nobel Peace Prize just a year or two ago. And in fact, you know, last year, Dr. Tilman Ruff from Australia came and spoke, sponsored by PSR at the University of Washington. Ruff is on the board of both ICANN and IPPNW, the International Physicians Group. They both won Nobel Prizes, so pretty eminent guy. And there is a lot of effort, and I have heard that in other countries of the world there are more people at the grassroots and more young people at the grassroots who are involved in the ICANN treaty process, the TPNW. So that's something of note. Sometimes people who are working on specific pieces of legislation say, like, well, yeah, of course we want to prohibit nuclear weapons, but this really is not realistic. It goes too far. Average American citizen or politicians can't hear this right now. And then in the middle, there's this campaign called Back from the Brink. So Back from the Brink tries to bridge those two ends of the spectrum in the fact that they have a 5-point program which does address many of the same areas that these pieces of legislation do, but it covers that spectrum all the way up to an international treaty among the nuclear powers, as well as the non-nuclear, prohibiting nuclear weapons. So starting with no first use, ending sole presidential authority to launch a preemptive strike, de-alerting at least a section of the nuclear weapons, so they are taken off some of the hair trigger alert status that they're now on, especially the ICBMs. Some might question whether the Tridents are just as threatening on hair trigger alert as the land-based missiles, but anyway, they tend to focus on the ICBMs out in Montana and the Dakotas and so forth. And then looking exactly at this point of an international treaty, starting with and including the nuclear-armed powers, as well as all of the other countries on the planet, to prohibit. So Back from the Brink is building a national coalition, just like here in Washington. PSR and other groups have started a statewide coalition, Washington Against Nuclear Weapons, which I think has, 47 groups now in it, right? And so likewise at the national level, Back from the Brink has brought in Union of Concerned Scientists. There are some church and religious organizations. There's Sierra Club now, 350.org. So you have these coalitions. But I think what is missing, as I said earlier today, is the engagement of a lot of people like they were in the 1980s, right, at a grassroots level. One of the things that we tend to forget about the 1980s is that they also, just like Back from the Brink, went through a process of city resolutions, state resolutions, county resolutions, professional organization resolutions. Many, many resolutions were passed, even in Congress. But the nuclear freeze itself, its halt to the testing, production, and deployment of nuclear weapons, never occurred. And that was at a time when there were literally hundreds of thousands of people in the street, when there were thousands of people being arrested at the gates and inside the inner security zones of nuclear weapons facilities. So I think resolutions are great, but if we're to have any chance of moving the needle on the powers that be, we have to start mobilizing at least at the level of the direct action that was occurring in the 1980s. And I think also, surveys have shown that younger people right now, people on college campuses, students, young workers, are concerned about nuclear weapons, but they feel it is hopeless and they don't believe in the political and governmental process. So that's why I was saying to some folks out here in private conversation, as well as in my talk, that I think that one possible experiment in truth, as Gandhi would say, is if we focus more on direct action in the streets, at the weapons facilities. I think that could be much more appealing to the next generation of activists and convince them that there is a passion and intensity behind this need to stop the nuclear war preparations that is similar to the passion and intensity that we do see in certain sectors of the climate movement. Okay, so I want to put those thoughts on the table. I also think that in addition to building bridges to the climate movement, building bridges to young people, particularly on college campuses and other areas, I think we also need to reach out to more conservative sectors of the population. We don't have to agree on everything, but I believe that Arlie Hochschild's book and other sources indicate that there is a shared concern about the survival of the next generation and life on this planet, and that we can find places of common ground. That's how it works all around the world. It's not that people agree about everything, it's that they have certain common concerns. You saw that in France, you see that in Iraq. The people who go into the streets, they want certain basic demands of equity and justice, jobs for the youth, and so on. And they may have wide differences. I saw this in Iraq, and this has been documented in France with the Yellow Vest movement. There are wide differences of perspective, but there's also common ground that's been found. So common ground, building bridges, campus organizing, direct action, and finally I would say that an urgency needs to be conveyed that the arms race is not static, that the development of first strike systems, like I was talking about, the automation of systems under artificial intelligence computers, this is pushing the situation with Russia and China and the United States to the brink. And people don't realize that. And I think they need to realize that. So those are just some thoughts of areas, growth areas for the movement, areas, directions that I think that we can move towards and that we need to move towards. And I think I will just leave it there, except to say that those instances that you mentioned about the Soviet naval commander in the Cuban Missile Crisis, also Mr. Petrov, who stopped the Soviet launches in response to this false attack, false warning, those were instances where all of the machine indicators, all of the computer signal tracks, all of the logical analysis by the systems that had been set up indicated we need to fire. And it was a human being who on intuition, that was the word that was used, gut feeling, went against the recommendations of that bureaucratic and automated system and said no. So that's a warning for us as we shift into more and more complex automated decision-making processes, that we need to not go in that direction. We need to keep it grounded in human responsibility, human rebellion, human intuition, human choice. So I just put that on the table, and I'd like to open it up. I don't know who's facilitating to questions and comments, from the circle.
Well, thank you also. Great. And I was jotting down a few notes. I'd also like to have Carly of the coalition speak. She's been leading great efforts to bring people together, and I think we would be well to listen to her voice for a few minutes. I don't know where to put this. But go ahead, Carly.
Yeah,
Please.
Firefly just asked me to chime in, so I don't really have anything prepared. And I'm bringing a lot of humility into this work. Being a young person, not having been born yet when the movement was broad and powerful and militant, but have a lot of interest, like a lot of folks in the room have said, in learning the lessons from the movement in the 80s, from the efforts, what worked, what didn't work, what's different now in our world, what's different now in our consciousness, right? How much farther along are we in the advancement of imperialism and capitalism as global systems dictating our everyday lives, and more importantly, the lives of people in the global South, right, who are majorly exploited by our current systems. So I work with Physicians for Social Responsibility. I'm an organizer for nuclear weapons abolition, and it's my honor to help facilitate our statewide coalition, Washington Against Nuclear Weapons, which has almost 3 years of experience now trying to build the statewide movement. There's some resources here if folks would like to check out anything. We have a petition, which is a great way to get on our weekly email list. Most of you probably get it already. Always open to suggestions and articles to go into it so that we can be in stronger coordination and communication as we build experiences, as we strengthen our work on the ground. There's clearly nothing to replace community level and deep relationship building inside of our communities. So this is a great way. It's a petition against the nuclear weapons modernization, which folks have talked about. One thing I like to point out is that $1.7 trillion is approximately how much student debt we have in the United States, and it's also the price of the modernization. So as you're talking to young folks, that's a great figure to keep in mind. But I'll circulate this if folks would like to sign on. Can I start this way? So it's a petition against the nuclear weapons modernization. Another point is just that folks have mentioned the different types of resolutions that have been passed at the local level, and I think it's solid organizing, right? You take action at the level that's most relevant. You build victories. That's something our movement hasn't seen a lot of in recent years. And I think the anti-war movement, as I get more accustomed to it, people haven't seen when they can take action and really demonstrate their power and make a concrete material impact. So I'm excited that there have been resolutions passed, like in Port Townsend, in Spokane, in other places at different levels. And this upcoming legislative session, we'd like to see, or we'd invite communities to organize and help pass a state level resolution so that Washington State can join California and Oregon in standing against New Jersey, parts of Maine legislature, in standing against nuclear weapons. So it would be the highest level of governance in Washington State, putting these 5 points that Peter mentioned from the Back from the Brink resolution on the books as a plea to Congress to put sane nuclear weapon policies in place. And that could look any number of ways, right? We can get the attention of our legislators through direct action, through lobbying, through through calls, through relationship building, through local resolutions. But we'd like to push at the legislative level starting in January, and that work of educating our legislators that folks in our communities care about this starts now. So I'll pass around this call to action card. It has a script on the back to make that call to your legislator, to share with your with people in your community. Yeah, so I'll share that around. And it links to a toolkit on our website that helps making action taking easier also, which has like samples, letters to the editor, sample organizational endorsements. So what we're trying to do is also make the tools accessible so we don't all have to spin our wheels and start from scratch every time again. And I'll just mention that the coalition is also growing. 350 Seattle just joined our local coalition. So we're hoping to bridge the silos between the movements. And you know, the world doesn't function in silos, right? People in the Marshall Islands know that, as the rising sea level is about to bridge the level of the Runit Dome where the nuclear waste is stored. Right, so these issues collide, and we have to go along with them. But any organization that's not already part of it is welcome to join, and I have those coalition forms here as well. But yeah, it's a joy to share space and learn how we can strengthen and really rebuild the anti-nuclear weapons struggle. So, thank you.
Thank you, Cardi. So I put on the clip here about Doug. Just, do you want to give us a
Sure.
32 minute of how did you get Port Townsend to move ahead on that resolution? This is Doug.
I was inspired by Timon Wallace, the author of the book Warheads to Windmills. Please take a copy of that if you haven't seen it. And his strategy was evolved out of the ICANN group that did the UN treaty. When I heard him speak, him and Vicki, they showed us a toolkit that included all sorts of visual aids, pamphlets on how you and your church and your co-op and your local government can get rid of all nuclear weapons. And I thought, oh, let's do a petition drive. And we got 5% of the voters of Jefferson County, about 1,000 people, to petition our city and county governments to pass a resolution sort of on the line of what Tim and nuclearban.us are suggesting. And where we didn't really succeed that well was getting a resolution that would pass that would approach the CEOs of the 26 corporations that make these weapons and encourage them with their power in the United Corporate States to move the spending away from nuclear products towards new green products. The book Warheads to Windmills talks about that conversion and how critically important it is for us as human beings to bring those technicians and engineers back into building what life needs in order to make it on this planet. So it was exciting to get the resolutions passed. They were directed to our two senators and our representative. I'll be meeting with Kilmer early in December, as will Peter, and that will be part of what we discuss. There's so many issues. And in regards to nuclear weaponry, I would protest some of what was said earlier. Any country that used 3,000 tons of depleted uranium on other parts of the planet has no right to talk about how nuclear weapons have never been used. We really did a horrible thing. And we haven't been responsible. And to say that responsibility is borne by your narrow shoulders and mine is daunting. But I don't know who else to ask. Somehow we have to change course on our national journey. I do like what the lady we invited to our Hiroshima and Nagasaki festivals said, I've forgotten her name, but she's a peace activist up in British Columbia. She and others have talked to the vice principals of their schools and invited themselves thereby into doing a social studies program on nuclear weapons. It's part of how kids need to understand the world, and they don't understand. How could they believe when what we have to tell them? She made a point that it's critically important to build a bridge of song as you load all this heaviness into young people's hearts. Together we can do something. Don't just put it in George Orwell's memory hole. It's already a lot of stuff there. So that's a brief sharing. And I would recommend that any group consider going to the people, because if you show up with the resolution signed by 1,000 or 2,000 or 500 of your signatures, you have credence there that you won't have if you don't. And saying that you're going to show up with that gives you permission to talk about the same issue a number of meetings. So it's really a valuable strategy, I think.
Also, if I can add to what Doug just said, nuclear weapons have also been used constantly as a threat. You know, implicit in all of our policy is if you don't agree with us, sooner or later we can attack you, and nuclear weapons could be part of that.
And can I also add that, as we say, that our young people in this country might be disillusioned, but just think about that when we had that climate day and that climate strike, there were 120 countries that participated. There were hundreds of thousands of Australian students that were out on the street. ICANN is active in 143 countries with 541 groups. Our kids might be disillusioned, but there are kids out there that are not disillusioned. So if we can look at who's getting things done and look to them and listen to the voice of this young woman and the knowledge that she already has. I mean, I have great, great hope in your generation. I mean, not that you're representing your whole generation, but there are other voices out there like yours, and they're
There
amazing.
were 2,000 people at the climate strike.
Exactly.
On 20th
For
September.
here.
Right.
Yeah,
In Olympia.
exactly. But in 120 countries, there are what, 7 million kids that participated that day?
Yes.
I mean, those kids know how to Skype. We don't. I mean, when was the last time I Skyped? I didn't know how to Skype, but they do. They already know that communication, and we are in a much different world. And those kids have been taught to I mean, I'm a former social studies teacher, yes, for us. And we have been in classrooms where we're teaching those kids all along to meet your neighbors, and it's live Skyping. It's not a textbook anymore, it's talking with kids. So those kids know how to talk.
So, having heard from our panelists and extemporaneously from a few other folks, what other comments or questions do other people have who haven't had a chance yet to speak?
I remember back when the war drums were beating on Iraq, we had 300 people in the street in Olympia. And then shock and awe happened, and the next week there wasn't even 30. How can we get the disillusioned back into a feeling of hope and believing now that we're looking at far greater details than just one country, Iraq? You know, we're looking at the world with the nuclear issues.
Get something done. Get some bills passed. We have, one of Glenn Anderson's, he has a flood of material that he has created on the table. But what he's done is has an item to support. The first item on there is the bill to support the treaty. And it has 7 sponsors now. That bill needs help. But if there are already areas that have support and that have endorsed this bill, and if we can get more of our senators and our congressmen to pass this bill, we already have a statement. Not that we are ratifying the bill, because when can we ever ratify a bill like that'll take us another 20 years. But you have intentions that we're in agreement with what you're trying to do. And that's definitely.
Good.
Lon?
Right.
Okay. My name is Lon, and I work with the OPAN group.
And I've heard about direct action and lobbying. What I haven't heard yet, and my own history is as an educator primarily, and a science educator in particular. And I think it would be a nice effort to try and approach the school systems, and including the teachers, and particularly science teachers, but social sciences as well, and to develop a curriculum, particularly at the high school level, I think would be most effective. So I think that's an avenue that, could be a productive and beneficial approach, both in terms of education and in terms of a change of policy.
That's exactly what we did in 1980. I was part of the teachers group that did that.
I actually worked, after I received my master's degree, on an NSF funded, that's National Science Foundation funded grant, which was aimed towards developing curricula, but it wasn't for nuclear weapons, it was about nuclear power. But there is a connection, and especially in the currently existing arsenal of nuclear power designs and fission technologies, that relates between fission power and fission bombs. So I think there's a direct connection there, and that could be actually part of a curriculum. But the curriculum should focus specifically on nuclear weapons. And I would think at the high school level would be most effective.
Speaking about how nuclear energy deals with nuclear weapons, another local activity, I lobby in legislature. Frequently a bill comes up for Washington taxpayer money to go to the development and building these nuclear power plants in Washington state, to give them what you call a tax holiday, so that these nuclear weapons producers like NuScale, not nuclear weapons, nuclear power facilities don't have to pay taxes, yet we do. So it does interrelate, because, like I think I said before, if this research can be applied, it's on a small scale, something that you can, not all nuclear research, but in these particular cases, it can be translated into development of more precise and capable nuclear weapons.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, I'm very impressed what I've heard here in this workshop and today. And recently, the Carly put it on the nuclear, the town hall meeting recently, and that whole thing about integrating the deep concern and crisis about climate crisis, emergency, and nuclear weapons. And I'm just ecstatic and happy to see the integration there. And in Tacoma, we need, and I want to do something with a lot of other people to bring us to the fore of the nuclear weapons thing and blend it in with the, because right now a lot of young people are concerned. I remember the nuclear freeze thing, and when our kids were small, and our oldest kid was this daughter at that time, 82, 83, whatever, all these massive protests in Seattle. But everybody's scared about them, just like they are now about nuclear. I'm sorry. Climate. Thank you. And then what happened was, when the Soviet Union collapsed, everybody talking about peace dividend. Well, we were very reluctant. We were dependent. We lost our sight, our vision, because we were waiting for. Apparently, there wasn't enough of us to be active like we had been, and it just fell apart. The movement fell apart. And that's part of where we're at now. And what Dahl said earlier about whether we win or not, it's really, we'd love to win, of course. That's survival. But the most important thing is to be moral and do the right thing. And we didn't do the right thing after the Soviet Union in terms of the. And so I just love in terms of pursuing the abolition of nuclear weapons, and we can do it now, because we've got to do it.
So you hold up countries like Ukraine and Kazakhstan that gave their nuclear weapons back to Russia. Okay, when we heard Turkey in the news and suddenly we didn't like what Turkey was doing, the first considered, whoa, we have nuclear weapons in Turkey, we better take them out. That's a good trend. That's a good trend if you're going back.
Yeah.
Anyone else who would like to join in the conversation? Bernie?
I lean very strongly toward direct action, mass direct action worldwide. We're not playing with a small game here. All the steps we mentioned have value. I'm not disagreeing with that. And what's her name? Old Pink.
Medea Benjamin?
Medea had a piece I just read yesterday or the day before about the inadequacy of what actions are being done, including Cold Pink's action. And I don't want to put all my eggs in this basket, but, or whatever you call it, balls. She said at some point, something's going to trigger mass action worldwide. And I look at Greta's leadership and the effect that she's had. 4 million students coming out for a strike on September 20th as an example. That's totally inadequate for what we're talking about. But it's an indication of possibilities. And given the gravity of our situation, climate and nukes, I hope and pray that will take place in some form or other as soon as possible, and so on. So I want to advocate that direct action, understanding and commitment, all of us here and everybody else, but we do everything we can now to break the educational type activities that we're talking about and build on those as best we can. Take part in direct action. I take part in Ground Zero's direct action and others regularly, as well as some people here. So that's one point. The other thing I want to broaden our understanding here is about human motivation and violence. At the end of the Gulf War, I started studying why humans are violent, and I'm still studying that. It's like overnight. We went from saying no to war in Iraq, and the yellow ribbons came out and looked like everybody was saying yes to the war in Iraq. But without getting too much into the big subject of human motivation, I'll point to Robert J. Lifton's article, or his research, and what he means by nuclearism. Identifying with nuclear weapons as though we are God and we have the power of God. That's not his words, that's mine. But if you read his and study his definition of nuclearism, the power of God, Thomas Merton said the same thing in different words. So that's where I'm at. And I just came back from my 15th year of going to India, Gandhi's message and my message as an activist with weapons and nukes and weapons and climate. And India and Pakistan have assumed that identity with God. Now, India has all kinds of gods, all kinds of points of view. Not everybody is with that viewpoint, but that's what Modi's nourishing in India, is making it a Hindu country, and Hindu is a version of God. It doesn't go back to the Blue State. And so I can get on a big soapbox here, but Arundhati Roy just came out with a book this summer of the essays she wrote for the last 20 years, starting with her first novel and ending with her latest novel a year or two ago. And if you saw her on Democracy Now! Last Monday, you can see that she does not see how to pull India together. It's too complex, it's ancient, it's got all these points of views, and so on. But when I look at Pakistan and India facing each other, with that outlook, that nuclearism, it's extremely scary. And I'm not the only one saying that by far. Some very more knowledgeable people than I am. So I don't want to get stuck with saying it's going to happen and we can't do anything. To me, the direct action direction that we're talking about, building toward that with the hope and prayer that somehow internationally, worldwide, will diffuse that situation in India and Pakistan, and as well as this country.
So you felt the energy of India and Pakistan is boiling around power over each other when you were there?
Well, yeah, every year I go there, and you know, Jammu and Kashmir are the fuse points in a way, but it's in Assam in eastern India. Modi's coming down on them. He's come up with a 2 million person registry to get the Muslims out of there. That's not directly stated, but that's what's happening in Kashmir. He's diluting the Muslim voice in that area. And the demonetization policy that started a few years ago, that hurts everybody. You got 400 million people in that country that are illiterate. And Arundhati Roy points this out in her book I mentioned. You know, they don't even know the stuff's going on in many ways. And so
When I was reading about modernization, that every nuclear country has modernized, they did say that when it came to Pakistan, Pakistan does not have a lot of weapons. I mean,
Pakistan's what?
Pakistan does not have a lot of weapons. I mean, when you look at how many weapons all the countries have, Pakistan and India are down here.
They got 130, 150.
Well, it's not 1,500, or it's not. But they are not. They said they were not ready to use. They were not ready for it to be deployed. Now I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to assemble a nuclear weapon. I have no idea that process. But they were not on standby because they're like in it. Help me with what do you do with a nuclear weapon?
They don't have delivery system, something like that?
They're just not ready to deploy them. You know, they have them, but they're not ready to deploy them.
And
so
there's a
that's
variety
like
of them. There's small, as the word goes,
okay.
and larger. But there's also who's in charge of those nuclear weapons in Pakistan. That's another variable we don't know.
Yeah.
You got, you know, very rabid fundamentalist Muslims identified with Pakistan, and we got people that want peace. I know some of the people that want peace in nonviolence in Pakistan. We have dialogues every year, you know, as much as we're able. So it's you can't say with one brush they're not deployed. We don't. It only takes one major blow up, and what does that
You don't
trigger?
need a whole lot of nuclear weapons to cause a lot of damage.
No.
Right.
And the question
One.
is, who presses the button?
Yeah.
We haven't heard from a few individuals. Anyone who has not yet had a chance to say anything, wish to? Bert?
Thank you. Well, as another young person like Carly, I'd like to suggest that this is something important to be taught to kids in school. My experience is they're much more open to hearing some of these things than adults in the street. I found the book JFK and the Unspeakable filled with really important information that I think we all should know. And the opposite of demonization, which we're going through now, you can point that out, we're demonizing Putin, is the first steps towards war. You demonize your enemy. It's what we did with Saddam Hussein, and it's very dangerous. Second thing you can say about the current situation is we have our NATO forces and missiles, nuclear missiles, within about a 15-minute flight from targets in the Soviet Union, into Russia, I should say. And that people have to realize means they have 15 minutes to decide whether to fire their weapons or lose them if they think this is really an attack. So that's very dangerous, having moved the weapons there. contrary to what we had verbally promised the Russians, that we would not do such a thing, we would not move NATO to their borders, is something American students, I think, would find important and interesting. And finally, the whole fascinating story of a correspondence between Nikita Khrushchev and John Kennedy. Private, out-of-channel correspondence, personal letters, 24 pages long, I think the first one from Khrushchev to Kennedy. Those are aspects of American foreign policy that you never hear about, and we don't know. And I think young people really want to know those kind of things because they make it intelligible. They make what happened. And I guess I'd finally add, they can learn about Operation Northwoods, which was our plan to have a terrorist attack, a false flag terrorist attack, to be blamed on the Cubans as an excuse to attack Cuba and start a nuclear war with Cuba, which of course would have been a nuclear war with Russia, Soviet Union at that time. So all of those things in our history we don't know about. Carly and I, as young people, can present that to the kids. They would. I really think that's kind of education. That my experience is that we do things like false flag operations, we do terrorist actions, we do dangerous things like moving our troops contrary to our promises right to the border with Russia, and why that's so dangerous. So those are the kind of things I think are teaching tools for the young people.
The first time I visited Hiroshima, I was 21, and it was 15 years or so after the bomb. And it was very formative in how I saw the world. I never will forget. They have a huge diorama showing what it was like after the bomb. And certain things stood out for me that I will never forget. There was a piece of cement, like a step, and a shadow on it. And that's where a person had sat. And they had vaporized. And I think these kinds of tales can be shared and told. And lots of weapons are very terrible, but they don't vaporize you unless it's Star Trek or something. And I've been for decades, an anti-nuclear power activist, because it's just one shade away from fissile material for a bomb. And there's a whole new push that nuclear is going to save the climate and blah, 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 blah. So anything we can do to stop that nonsense. And I'm going to leave now because there's a closing that I'm co-leading in 15 minutes. Don't forget to fill out your evaluations, the green paper you've got when you came.
And a P.S. There's a permanent exhibit at the UN in New York with another one of those stones and the shadow of the stones, but it's there.
We have 3 minutes. Louise would like to say something. I'd like to say something.
Okay. Well, I've also gone to Hiroshima, and actually last year, and gone through the museum and the Peace Park and all. And I just wish every member of Congress could go there. And it's been going through my head, and this may sound really stupid, but I have thought about buying a copy of John Hersey's Hiroshima book for every member of Congress. And I'm going to check with FCML to see whether they think that is a reasonable idea and that they would facilitate distributing those. I can't imagine anybody reading that book and not being affected.
I can think of a few legislators.
I can imagine Jim Jordan reading it.
So,
That's true.
one of the things I wanted to say about Ground Zero is knowing that many more young people are focused on climate crisis because they can see it, it's in real time, and it's there forever. So we have decided that instead of us going alone on stopping nuclear weapons, we need to link hands and hearts with the young people who are working on climate crises and we're going to be having joint actions, which I like that a lot. Also, we need to involve young people. So in that copy of the Ground Zero newsletter that I was passing around, thank you, there's a picture of this young 9-year-old. And she got her grandmother, her mother, and other family members, her grandmother also got them, but to be on the street. And we need more kids involved. Their lives are on the line. And yesterday at a Ground Zero meeting, somebody said that the state police was very uncomfortable with having a juvenile in the road. And someone in our group said, yeah, we have a policy that we're not supposed to have kids in risking arrest. And I said, that is nonsense. We need to have those kids out in the road because their lives are on the road. So we need to get kids in the streets, basically. And the last thing is, as a teacher, kids are terrified. Active shootings. We just had a drill practice about that at school with the 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. Every one raised their hand when asked if they think about the school shooting. And we need to expose the reality. Your daughter is speaking today. They need to know that their lives could be vaporized in a flash and not try to protect them. They don't need protection. They need truth and a way to act.
And I wish the kids were required to read Hiroshima Mon Amour. So if you want to do something nice for Christmas, give a class set of 30 and donate it to the local school. A class set of 30 will cover probably everyone in the class, and the teachers could decide who will use it.
May I say something, please,
Sure.
very quickly?
Yeah.
About the children, I think it is important as an educator to realize the sensitivities that children can have and what the potential harms that could be. And I understand your point. I used to think that way as well. Lay the truth out there. They need to know the truth. But that can be harmful in certain circumstances to certain children in particular. So those kinds of sensitivities, I think, do need to be taken into account. That's not to say don't do what you're talking about generically. I actually brought a chapter of PSR into a school that I was working in the Bronx in 1981. And it was headed by Vic Seidel, as a matter of fact. A group from PSR, from Albert Einstein College of Medicine, came to my school that I coordinated that visit. And they presented on nuclear weapons and their effects. And this was to an elementary school, not high school. But they were sensitive, the presentation was sensitive to the needs of the children and in cooperation with what felt comfortable to the teaching staff as well. So these kinds of considerations need to be taken into account. Finally, and then I think we should give you another chance, but I'd like to ask the two women who have not spoken yet if they have any questions or anything they'd like to say. You and you.
I'm fine.
Okay, don't mean to force you, just to give an opportunity.
I have a great deal to say, but this isn't the right time, probably. I just wanted to say I've been to Hiroshima too, and one of the things that touched me so deeply was the museum that was in the basement when I was there, of all the artwork that came out of people as they were going through the experience. And so for me, bringing creativity into whatever actions we can, anyway, I would love to talk with a number of you more.